In this first version, we'll be going over the most basic approach, sculpting. I often use this approach for chunkier, more cartoony types of hairstyles, since those often don't play well with the traditional curves and strands. As you might imagine, this involves using ZBrush's essential sculpting brushes. The ones I most commonly use for this process are Move, Smooth, Pinch, Inflate, Stream Dynamic, and Damien Standard. I highly recommend binding some of these to your keyboard for the sake of speed and efficiency.
And with that, let's kick off our first hairstyle. What I normally do is start with a sphere and roughly manipulate it to fit the shape that I want for that particular piece, then duplicate it to create additional strands. If you ever feel like you don't have enough geometry in that particular strand and you're running out of geo, feel free to use Dynamesh as you see on the right of the screen. Just make sure to use a low value, because going too high will just make it a little bit too dense and will make it very hard to control. I usually like to turn on polish, just because it usually makes the strands a little bit rounder and cleaner. You can lose a bit of the detailing when you do that sometimes, so make sure you do that when you're doing the block out as opposed to when it's already detailed. Occasionally you're going to want to rotate your hair strand, and you want to control the origin point of the rotation. So what I usually like to do is change the gizmo position to the root. That way, even as you're rotating the strand, it doesn't lose the origin point. You can do that by holding Alt to unlock the gizmo and just holding one of the rotations or the positions. So it's either one of the circular shapes in the middle or one of the arrows on the corners. One more thing I like to do is create a hair cap for the character, so they don't look bald between the strands. You can do it in a variety of ways. What I normally do is mask off that particular part of the back of the head, then just extrude it and Dynamesh it. That way you cover the back of the head, and it's still pretty low poly and manageable. Main thing to keep in mind as you're going through this process is don't expect immediate results. Just enjoy the road, remember our do's and don'ts, and just make sure the character holds up from every angle.
I think for a lot of people, this would instinctively be the go-to solution for sculpting hair, just because it's the most common approach to sculpt anything, because it's basically just that, it's sculpting. So the process is very familiar to a lot of people who've done ZBrush before, where you start with a sphere or any shape that you quickly Dynamesh, so you're not restricted by the poly count and topology, and then you just shape it freeform. So in a way, it's very liberating because you don't have to be concerned with working low poly or kind of adhering to the topology. You're just doing whatever you want, which is really nice. The problem with that is that it can get messy pretty quickly, and that's something that can take a while to kind of get a good control of. Just because, as you can see in the footage, this is sped up and still 15 minutes in, this still looks pretty bad. Just because it's pretty shapeless. The reason for that is that there's not been a lot of polish on the actual subtools. So if you look at each individual strand, it still looks very clay-like. And that's something that will gradually improve, but it's also important to not kind of fixate on that at this stage because I don't really care about that. The only thing I care about is just getting the volume right, the silhouette right, and everything just kind of looking clean outside of the actual craftsmanship of the sculpt. So that's what you should be concerned with. One very common mistake that I've seen a lot is that you go too high poly too quickly, and then it just gets very difficult to control, right? So that's why I'm using Dynamesh, but the resolution is very, very low because the higher the resolution, the more polygons I have, and the more difficult it is to control. And since I don't really care about how it looks right now in terms of the micro details and just caring about the silhouette, then you can go as low as you want or as you can actually. Just the lower, the better, because that way you're not constricted by moving 500,000 polygons around. So you keep it pretty small, and then you can always up the resolution and add some detailing. So you've seen that I'm adding a little bit of hard edges. It's not the final look. I'm just trying to get a sense of what that would look like. But you'll see as we're nearing the completion of this sculpt that it starts getting a lot better. But don't rush it. Don't be alarmed just because it still doesn't look good. It's not supposed to look good, right? Because we're not caring about that. Just kind of looking at the silhouette. So you'll notice that I rotate the character around a lot just because I want to see how that feels, just in terms of a nice balance of curves, of thick strands versus thin, just clean shapes overall, and then I can just fix up the polish. One good thing about GeoHair is that that would be probably the most versatile solution for all hairstyles. Because not all hairstyles have this kind of look where you have a ton of different strands. Some of them, depending on the art style, are very blocky and very chunky. You would see hairstyles that would just be one massive mesh with a lot of sculpted detail. And those can look great. If you're going for sort of figurine kind of look, let's say something like Disney Infinity, which is almost Lego-like, right? Because you can actually feel the tangibility of the material. So you don't want to have a lot of small meshes. You want to keep it like a piece, like an actual sculpted piece. So that's one thing we could have also done with this hairstyle. If we wanted, we could have just had one big chunk of hair. And then sculpt the details on top of that. And for that, Geo would really be the only solution because you wouldn't use a curve brush for one big piece because you want to control the width, you want to control the shape in a way that a lot of other sort of pre-made brushes don't allow. So you just got to figure out before you kind of step into the which kind of method you want to use for creating hair. You want to figure out which one is the most appropriate one, right? If let's say I was doing some sort of Guile haircut from Street Fighter, for example, where if you're familiar with the character, it's a totally absurd haircut. It doesn't make any sense, but that would instinctively be a geo workflow for me as opposed to anything else because I wouldn't manually create a ton of curves just to get that sort of shape, which is very, very unique and particular, right? Because it looks very blocky. So it's all about the character. It's all about the kind of look that you're aiming for. So don't always go to the solution that is more instinctive for you. Back when I was just starting to use curve brushes, for example, which you'll see in the next chapter, it used to be my go-to solution for everything. And I pretty quickly realized that it's just not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It's not going to work on everything. And then I had to start creating sort of other hairstyles with other methods. So if you go to my portfolio, for example, you will see the Lucy character that I did from Cyberpunk, and she has a very particular hairstyle which curves would never have worked for, at least not in the way that I was envisioning it. It was sort of almost like a hard surface kind of look, where it almost looks like metal, just a thin layer of metal. So for me, that was immediately a geo solution. And I did that through modeling, actually. So I basically extruded a certain area of her head, kind of just manipulated that in 3ds Max, and just kept it very low poly. Because that's something I always try to do. I always try to start low poly because that just makes it a lot easier to control. But I didn't use curves for that at all, or the curve alpha, which you will see in the last chapter. So always think about what is going to be the best approach for your particular character. One thing that definitely changes from person to person when it comes to sculpting, and not just hair sculpting, but everything, is how you want to approach the subdivisions or the poly count. So a lot of people, or most people who are familiar with ZBrush, their go-to solution is kind of hidden control D to subdivide the model. That pretty much multiplies the amount of polygons that you have, which is something that works for a lot of scenarios. And the second option is using Dynamesh like I'm using now, which you're raising the poly count limit, but it's just a lot easier to kind of play around with because it's just changing the resolution. And also, you still have one subdivision level. And that's something that is very important with ZBrush, is that a lot of options and features almost kind of get blocked when you're subdividing your mesh, which is why I actually very rarely do it. I usually keep it just very low with either Dynamesh or dynamic subdiv, which you're going to see in the next chapter a lot. So dynamic subdiv is basically subdividing your model, but in a way that's reversible, and it just sort of simulates it. It's almost like hitting the 3 button in Maya, where it shows you a smooth version of your mesh without actually adding any polygons. So you can always hit Shift D to go back to the default unsmooth look, and that's something that I do a lot. So that is basically my go-to approach for almost everything in ZBrush. And the last option is using Sculptris Pro, which is a fairly new feature, but one that is pretty amazing. If you're not familiar with it, I would highly recommend go to Michael Pavlovich channel on YouTube. And he has a few tutorials on that, but it's a really neat trick. It's basically a way to dynamically add polygons to the mesh that you're working on based on your need without having to do anything. Depending on the size of the brush, it kind of figures out how many polygons you're going to need for that specific area. It isolates that area basically, which is really nice because sometimes you just need a bit more geometry or density in one area. For example, that happens to me a lot of times when I'm sculpting the anatomy, where I just want to get that specific vein in a specific spot. And even though the mesh is pretty high poly, I'm still not getting smooth and polished results. So for something like that, Sculptris Pro is really nice. So you can use any of those approaches. I know a lot of 3D artists who use completely different methods than me, and I think that's totally fine. Whatever works for you. But for me, my solution is always either Dynamesh for geo, like I'm doing now, or dynamic subdiv when I'm working with low poly meshes. That's just a good way to kind of work. And the biggest reason is that when you're using dynamic subdivs, you can actually manipulate the topology with ZModeler. So ZModeler is a really cool tool. It's basically ZBrush's modeling kit. So you can do pretty much everything, or at least most of what you can do in traditional modeling software. So you can add or remove edge loops. You can kind of weld vertices. You can collapse certain edges or weld together or detach or extrude or inset, or you can basically do everything. And when you have subdivision levels, you can't use ZModeler. You can do very basic things like, selecting a polygroup, for example, in ZModeler, but you can't really change the topology. And since that's something I do all the time, that sort of limits me from using subdivision levels. Just play around with each of those methods, see what kind of works best for you, and just practice on that until you really control it to a degree that you feel is giving you all the tools that you want to create a good sculpt. So one thing I want to kind of talk about is my use of color, which I think is not always super common to apply colors in such an early stage. So a lot of times, I think, especially in the past, I would see a lot of clay sort of renders or uncolored models being showcased on ZBrush, more of like a traditional sculpt, almost like a physical sculpt. And that is a fantastic look, especially for a lot of realism, where color isn't as much of an issue just because there's a lot of micro detailing that you're caring about. For me, using this sort of stylized art style, color plays a huge part in the way that you're selling your character or the overall appeal that you're shooting for. So by applying colors early, even if it's not really, detailed or you don't get all the shades that you want, it gives me sort of like a goal. Even if you look at some of the time lapse videos on my YouTube, you'll see that I apply the colors way before I even weld the meshes. So they can be completely separate meshes, like, arms, torso, neck, everything is separate, and I already apply the colors. Just because that gives me more of a vision of sort of what I'm going for, and it just brings me closer to my goal, even if it doesn't look that great at that particular stage. In the past, I used to spend hours upon hours just working on the sculpt with like a matte cap, no colors. And then as soon as I applied colors, I realized that, okay, this was not what I was going for at all. So those two have to work in harmony. That's why a lot of the times I would constantly switch between colors and clay. Colors and clay. And when I say clay, it's basically turning off the colors, which you can do by holding shift click on the brush right next to the subtool name. So by doing a shift click, you basically turn off all the colors for all the subtools. And doing that again will restore all the colors. And as you can see now, that's something that I do all the time, just because colors can be useful, but they can also be a distraction. I've noticed that a lot of times when I turn off the colors, I start to look at some of the errors in the silhouette and just some of the volumes. And when I turn them back on, I notice new errors because that sort of gives me a new perspective or a new point of view. So don't just sort of be fixated on one sort of rendering style or just one sort of material. Even lighting, that's one more thing I like to do. I like to like create a rim light, even though it's still again an early work in progress, and rim light is something that you would associate with like a final render or something. I do that a lot, just because it helps me visualize the final sort of render that I'm going for. So if you're really into the stylized art style and color plays a huge part in what you do, just apply them pretty early on. That would be my tip. And then start adding little touches like highlights or certain shadows. You can see that I added a bit of a lighter hue to the tips of her strands, just because it gives it a little bit more depth, and it's just something that I like to do. And this trend is gonna change a million times, right? By the time I'm done, but still, this helps me visualize how I want it to look in the end, and it just gives it a lot more depth, right? So I usually just make the root a little bit darker, the tip a little bit lighter, and I normally kind of go to the other subtools as well, even if they're unrelated to hair, just because I like to kind of complete the package, right? Because fixing one thing shines a light on another area that actually maybe isn't as great or just doesn't hold up as much. You can see by the way that I kind of darkened the buzz cut area just to kind of differentiate it from the main shape of the strands. And one thing that I would definitely suggest using four colors a lot is the poly paint options that you have on the right. Like you're seeing now that you have adjust colors and all of that. It's just fantastic because it allows you to very easily turn down the brightness or increase the saturation or mask specific areas, which is insanely cool. You can just kind of take the tooltip, you can sample a certain color, and then that would mask that particular color within that specific subtool. So I do that a lot, right? Let's say I want to just change the color of the eyebrows. The eyebrows are painted into the face poly paint. Then I would just go to the adjust colors option. I would sample the eyebrows, and that would immediately just isolate them, instead of me having to manually go with the mask brush and just sort of mask over it. So that's a really useful tool. So just I suggest you do that a lot, just because it's very easy to kind of play around with the colors until you sort of reach a result that you're really happy with. So at this point, you can see that it's starting to take shape, but it still looks pretty unpolished and pretty wobbly. So it still breaks a lot of the sort of do's and don'ts that we went over, just because it doesn't look like it's organic or dynamic. It feels very stiff. It almost feels like tubes. Because it is, because I started with a sphere and it still has some of that round shape, which I'm trying to gradually sort of alleviate, just to get a more natural look, and also kind of relax the strands. So one thing that I'm always trying to do with my characters is sort of change direction based on the gravity and the angle of their head. Same here. Let's say a particular strand is bigger than the others, so it would be more affected by gravity, and therefore I would pull it down a little bit more, or maybe curve it in a way that you would expect in real life. A lot of that definitely comes through just experience and practice, because it can be a little bit hard to explain, because it's not an exact science that is measurable. But in terms of applying it to an actual sculpt, it kind of comes with experience. Because natural is a very subjective term when we're talking about an art style or a character. One thing that might look natural to me would not look natural to you, and vice versa. So the hair right now, you can see that I'm still kind of shaping it because I don't want it to look too asymmetrical. This is obviously a very asymmetrical hairstyle, but I don't want it to look detached, almost like it's almost like a hairpiece, like a wig, right? And that's sort of the feeling that I'm getting right now, where it doesn't feel like it's coming off her head in a way that is convincing to me, and it's just not interesting enough. It doesn't feel organic. So there's a lot of trial and error. There's no shame in undoing something that you did. Sometimes I would try things, especially when I don't have a clear reference, like now, where I have the reference for Vi, which I'm occasionally looking at, but I'm not trying to go with this particular hairstyle one to one. Just because I want to use it as reference. I'm also looking at the other two references, trying to sort of get something that I'm happy with, that maybe is not an exact match to the obvious example on the left. So there's a lot of back and forth where I'm kind of playing around with the strand, trying to kind of visualize what that would look like if it's longer than the others or is in a completely different direction. And sometimes it's not going to work out. So there's no shame in deleting a subtool or undoing. I can say that it gets a lot easier when you're using very clear reference and concept, because that way you know exactly what a certain strand is supposed to look like from a particular angle. And if you're going for just one fixed angle, then it gets a lot easier because you don't have to care about the other angles. And there's a lot of that kind of fakery in 3D, especially in movies and shows and everything that you really only show in one angle, and you don't really care about how it looks from the back. If you Google 3D rendering Simpsons meme, you're probably gonna see that, which is basically a family joke about how 3D looks good from just one angle and the back is totally messed up. But for me, because I always do like a 360, then it's important for me to make sure everything looks great from every angle. Almost like I'm 3D printing it, which a lot of times that's exactly what I'm doing. I've 3D printed most of my models, so I don't want them to look good from just one angle. I want them to have a complete 360 that I'm happy with. And that really sells the sort of 2D aesthetic that I'm going for a lot with some of my cel shaded rendering. Because getting weird shapes is a very 3D thing, right? Getting wobbly shapes, misshapen, and that kind of breaks the illusion a lot of times. So for me, I definitely just rotate the character a lot. Do that all the time. That is my biggest tip to you. Just constantly spin your character around until everything looks good, and not just from the front or from the particular angle that you're going for, from basically every direction. So at this point, it's really starting to take shape. I still feel like these trends are a little bit repetitive looking and not really that dynamic, but at least they don't look just like duplicates of each other. You can see that there's a lot of breaks in the silhouette where I kind of create tinier pieces of hair that kind of stick out just to kind of break some of that monotony of the hair. So basically, just kind of creating a little bit of variation, right? So don't only have big strands or small strands. Just make a nice mix, small, medium, large, kind of intertwine them, just so you can create a look that just feels a little bit more visually interesting. So you might notice that from time to time I'm switching to brush called snake hooks, and then basically using it very similarly to move. Those two brushes are pretty similar, but the reason I use snake hooks is because it allows me to make smaller changes than move. So, for example, let's say I want to just change the direction of the tip of a certain piece, right? Just the last couple of vertices. I would not necessarily use move for that because move for me is more for bigger changes. A lot of people use snake hooks to sort of like create smaller strands or even create like horns of a character's forehead, for example, which is a way to do it. But I use it completely differently. So if you ever feel like you're not getting enough control using the move brush, try using snake hooks. It actually allows you to create much more extreme shapes and just also control the smaller details. So play around with them, and I believe that you start using snake hooks way more often than you can imagine. So in this moment, you'll notice that I'm using H polish, which is more of a traditional sculpting brush. It's something that you use a lot for rigid or solid pieces, let's say rocks, walls, anything that is very flat and planar. I use that sometimes to sort of flatten out particularly round shape, like I'm getting now with my sphere, with my, well, they're basically spheres, right? Because they did start with spheres, but I'm slowly shaping them into hair strands. So, sometimes I just want to create a flatter look from a particular angle. So I would go ahead with one of those brushes and just kind of flatten it out. So you'll notice that occasionally I'm switching my smooth brush to smooth cloth instead of the regular smooth. The reason for that is that in a lot of cases it gives you more control over the overall form of the mesh, whereas the regular smooth brush mostly affects surface level details. So when you're using a smooth brush, more often than not, it's not gonna change the border. Sometimes you want to smooth out just the sides or just the overall silhouette of something, and so the smooth brush isn't gonna cut it for that. In that case, I switch over to a smooth cloud brush, and I just switch between the two pretty often. So I would definitely suggest experimenting with that. So in this point, you'll notice that I'm using a brush called Makat. And it's a brush I've been using for a few years now, and it's actually one of my main brushes. It's used in a way that's similar to Damien Standard in that it creates a nice hard edge. And I use those two kind of interchangeably, just because it gives you a little bit more variation in terms of the hard shape that you're getting. I use it on faces a lot. Let's say when I want to create a pretty specific crease for the eyelids, for example, or if I want to create a bit of planar shapes, then that's one of my go-to brushes. So try to experiment with it a little bit. You can find it on Google in a lot of places. It's called Makat, M-A-H, cut, and it's actually it's gonna change your life. If you're going for a stylized art style, then that's definitely gonna make a big difference. So a lot of people have been asking me about what kind of material I use, because it's got a bit of a flatter look to it, but it's not exactly flat shaded. So it's a lot of people are surprised when I tell them it's just a regular skin shade material. It's basically a default ZBrush material. But I play around with the properties a little bit in the material modifiers menu. The main thing that I like to do is turn up the ambient and turn down the diffuse. That gives it a nice flatter look, and also turning on wax preview, which you can also do under material. It gives it almost like a bit of a glow. Don't turn it up too much, otherwise it's gonna your character is gonna look like a candle. Keep it pretty low. It's almost like a subsurface scattering type of look, where there's a little bit of redness in areas, and also an outline, right? So even when I'm not rendering, I like to have a little bit of a thin outline around my character, which you can also do under the material settings under mixer. Keep it thin and pretty low opacity, but I find that it just accentuates a lot of detailing that might otherwise be just a little bit obscured. So just play around with it a little bit until you find a balance that you like.
If you ever want to make big proportional changes to your hairstyle, like making it bigger or smaller, or just kind of shaping differently, and you have your hair strands on different subtools, you can do that by using Transpose Master that I just marked on the screen. You can also do that through the Transpose option in your gizmo. So don't be afraid to make sweeping changes, even if your subtools are separated.
So one question I've been getting a lot, unrelated to hair, just in terms of being a 3D artist, is how to make it in the field. As a lot of you know, it's a highly competitive field. There's a lot of 3D artists out there and a limited amount of jobs, and it can be very hard to be able to find your own place and get job offers or make it as a 3D artist in the industry. So one question I've been getting a lot is what should I do to kind of stand out? And I think for me the answer has always been finding your own style. I think being jack of all trade, master of none is going to make it pretty difficult for you to find a job, because most companies, and that's kind of coming from experience, most companies prefer someone who's very, very good at one thing than who's kind of average at everything, right? So very early on when I started doing 3D art, I had to kind of deal with the question of what am I going to focus on? So am I going to be a character artist, an environment artist, or even VFX or maybe tech art? And immediately I knew that characters were my thing, right? Even before I got to 3D, I would always draw and sketch ever since I was a toddler, basically. And the thing that I would always sketch would be characters. So I knew that that would be my path on my journey to being a 3D artist. And that's basically the second thing I did, right? When I got into 3D in 2014. So my first ever project was just my own bedroom, which didn't look really great, but it did allow me to kind of practice some of the fundamentals of doing 3D. And then immediately after, I did my favorite character of all time, which is Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, which I still work on that guy. I actually remade that model several times. It's almost like a benchmark to my journey as a 3D artist and how much I improve from year to year. But the point is that I knew that I wanted to do characters. So while a lot of my peers kind of dabbled in a lot of different fields, some of them even went the VFX route or animation or rigging, I focused all of my efforts on 3D. So it was only a matter of weeks after I started doing, working on the introduction to Maya course that I got ZBrush. And then I knew that that's what I wanted to focus on, because even though it can have a bit of a barrier of entry, because, the UI isn't really as straightforward as one might hope. And sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating because, as you can see, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of menus and a lot of things that can easily confuse you. I knew that that is what I wanted to focus all my efforts on. So very early on, I would look at, some of my favorite artists on ArtStation and just try to replicate what they're doing. And obviously, initially it didn't work out. And when I say initially, I mean the first 2 years. But I knew that eventually I was going to get it. And I was going to reach a point where I'm happy with my art and I'll get some recognition. And my point is, don't despair, right? A lot of people tell me I've been spending hundreds of hours over the last few months trying to make cool stuff in ZBrush, and it's not getting any likes or it's not getting any recognition. And what I always say is be patient, just keep practicing, try to challenge yourself by learning new techniques. If you see that something isn't working, then try to figure out how to make yourself unique and how to leave a mark, right? And how to make people go, wow, so that is this guy's art style. That's the one way to set you apart from the pack.
So now that we have our geo here in a pretty good spot, I usually like to do a nice little 360 just to show the character from different angles, and also it helps me make sure that everything is nice and clean. There's no wobbliness. I'm kind of adhering to everything that we went over in the do's and don'ts, and it's just a really nice way to showcase your character. You can do that through the movie menu right next to material. And with that, it's time to move on to our second set of hair, which is the long hairstyle. I'll be utilizing the curve brushes to achieve this, which is a pretty different workflow, but there's a lot of similarities. I'll spare you the whole blockout stage since we already went through this. So I'll already have a pretty decent base and we can kind of go from there. See you then.